kind of went back to both sides with it and showed examples of when he did it himself.
Yeah.
And when he shared a story, and afterwards I was just like, I still find my times confused, like if it is okay or isn't okay. So that makes it hard when you're trying to preach it, if how you're laying it out there.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of where I land on the thing, I really do think part of what's beautiful about the Psalms is in the difficult experiences of life, where we most wrestle with whether or not it's okay either to feel this way or to communicate that we feel this way, because it seems irreverent. God, in His grace, actually gives us a language to communicate our frustration with God to God. See, that to me is just amazing. God said, when you are frustrated with me, here's a language that you can use to express how you feel. Gosh, that is stunning. And not only that, that binds us together with those of preceding generations who have felt the same way and who used the same language. It actually bonds us together in our pain and our struggle and our frustration as we cry out with one collective voice, again, across the generations, across the centuries, across the continents, and even in this case, across the covenants. And the Psalms give us not only, I think, permission, but even, in fact, invitation to express ourselves honestly but reverently. There is a way to lament with reverence, and there is a way to express frustration with reverence. The expression of frustration is not automatically irreverent. The Psalms say so. And in Psalm 22, verse 1, you get a particularly, I think, clear indication. So that to me, it really is remarkable. And I think I can't, do you go by Zach or Zach? I can't remember.
Zach.
Okay. I think the issue, Zach, that you're raising is a really, really important one in relationship to the Psalms, and it impacts how people read the Psalms devotionally on their own. So here, as it relates to preaching, is what I think is important. Being honest about the frustration, but being particularly clear to communicate as a preacher within a posture of reverence. You know, I mean, sometimes our emotions as we preach are the hardest part for people to interpret. And so I think when I'm in those passages that deal with honest frustration, I'm going to err a little on the side of making sure I'm clear that I'm expressing this reverently and let the psalm carry a little bit more of the frustration weight so people don't just think I'm mad at God that day and unload. And even to find words to clearly communicate the kinds of things that I've just been talking about. Sometimes God is just way less threatened than Christians that are determined to protect God. So Christians will, you shouldn't say that, you shouldn't do that, that, reflects a lack of this, that, or the other. And God's just not nearly as threatened by it as sometimes as people are. I'll even say things like that. Just in an effort to help people frame that differently. And that can be worship. A posture of reverence, that's worship. When you don't understand, when you don't like what's going on, and you express worship anyhow, those may be some of our greatest worship moments. When everything makes sense, it's appropriate to worship. When life is good, it's appropriate to worship. It's always appropriate to worship. But there's something powerful about that moment when, amidst all the confusion, amidst all the frustration, you worship in spite of your experience of God in a given moment. It's good stuff. And the Psalms point us there in a way that is, along with books like Lamentations, but it's pretty distinct, pretty almost unique. Other challenges that you face?
I think it's tough. Going back to what you said, thinking about the Psalms in its entirety, instead of just like little snippets, like you reference like how you can see that in like devotional books and stuff like that. And I think the Psalms, it's pretty tough in and of itself. It's hard to do with any Bible passage, not to take it completely out of its context and just preach on any passage, but in the Psalms, because you have so many poetic, nice sounding things that you can just take and really just comfort people with or stuff like that, when sometimes it's you do that and you completely rip the meaning away from what that it's trying to be said, and so it's just kind of trying to find that balance of finding what it is you're trying to say but not ripping it completely out of its context, because when you do that you're taking a meaning to something that's not there. And so I think that's probably a big challenge that I see.
A part of what comes with that to me is, it's one thing to talk about dealing with the whole psalm when the psalm's short. When it's Psalm 133, okay, fantastic. I'll deal with the whole psalm.
Yeah.
Psalm 131, Psalm 133, yeah, baby, I got it. But I give you the option of Psalm 136, that's a much longer psalm. Or what about Psalm 119, which is the longest chapter in the Bible? Well, Psalm 119 sort of goes into a bit of a different category. When I preach Psalm 119, I usually preach one of the sections as representative of the whole, because they're intertwining themes, the same basic theme that moves through each of the alphabetically organized sections. So usually what I'll actually do is say, the way this psalm works, each section of the psalm is dealing with the same basic themes. So I'm going to deal with this section as representative of the whole thing. I treat that one a little bit different. Outside of that, I really try to go ahead and preach the whole psalm, and if I need to, just say less about each individual section, but try to connect people to the whole thing. And you can do that. You just have to say, you gotta say less about the individual parts in order to stress the big picture. It's possible to preach a scene with contextual sensitivity to the whole song. To preach a verse with sensitivity to the whole song, contextual. But, and so, you know, I wouldn't argue against doing that, but in my own preaching practice, I really try to deal with the whole thing because people have almost never heard that. And just to try to help people see how stuff fits together. So that to me is a huge challenge. Just kind of interacting with what Devin's saying and working with the implications of the unit of thought being the psalm. The longer the psalm gets, the harder that is. But again, they were sung in their entirety. And they fit together in a way that is coherent and that you can do that. So for example, if you choose Psalm 136 to preach from, yeah, I mean, it's fairly long, but there's a clear sense, through the refrain, there's a clear sense of logic to it that holds the thing together. So what you do is you build off that repeated, hammered out idea of the Lord's covenant faithfulness enduring forever. And then you just talk about all the examples in relationship. I mean, you almost kind of have a sermon that's organized like with a hub and spokes coming off. Other challenges that you've noticed in preaching from the Psalms? Or things that you're specifically wondering about? Do you have other kinds of specific questions?
I think another thing is kind of what you said earlier, when, you know, sometimes the Psalms are connected to something later, like in the New Testament, they're being quoted and stuff like that. And so when you're preaching from the Psalms, how much time do you spend on talking about when they're quoted in the New Testament versus, you know, just focusing on the Psalm itself and the context of when it was?
It varies.
Yeah.
It varies. If I'm doing an Old Testament series from the Psalms, I'll spend most of the time in the Psalm itself. But I may make brief reference in the body of the sermon or even culminate the sermon at the end with the New Testament connection. It depends on the nature of the connection. But usually I can connect it up late in a way that theologically and emotionally piques the sermon. Because it usually, I mean, you know, if it shows up in the New Testament, it relates to something about the person and work of Jesus, somehow, directly or indirectly. And so I can usually establish ideas working through the psalm that talk about the person and work of Jesus in relationship to the culmination of God's nature, character, intent as reflected in the psalm. And so a lot of times that's what I'll do to keep most of the sermon in the primary text of the psalm, but allow the theological accent at the end to culminate in a way that recognizes that the psalm in that sense is not the last word. Does that make sense? Now, if I'm preaching from a New Testament passage that includes an Old Testament citation, I do the exact reverse. I'll only talk about the Old Testament citation to the degree it's necessary to understand how that flavors and influences the New Testament writer's inclusion of the material. It's a matter of degree and emphasis. it is not particularly common for me to preach a symmetrical sermon where I spend half time each place. That's not really characteristic of me. But the fact that it's not characteristic of me doesn't mean that it's wrong for you. And I will occasionally preach a really balanced, theologically oriented sermon that deals half with each, with the connecting point being the reason I chose each. But it's a lot of times more pragmatic issues that I'm doing a series through the Psalms. I kind of want the primary accent to be there. If I'm going through Hebrews 1, 5 through 14, where 7 Old Testament passages are cited and linked together.